Imagine a man who ruled a city with a whisper, not a shout. A man who sat in the shadows of Boston's underworld, his hands stained with the blood of countless enemies. Yet his name was whispered with a strange, perverse mix of terror and a twisted form of respect by the very people he terrorized. This is not a fictional tale spun from the reels of a Hollywood gangster movie. This is the chilling, complex, and deeply unsettling true story of a boy from the gritty projects of South Boston who became a king, a monster, and a cautionary tale, all wrapped into one enigmatic, ice-cold persona. But this story holds a dark, corrosive secret at its very core, a twisted, Faustian bargain that would blur the lines between good and evil forever, corrupting the very institutions sworn to uphold justice. If you are ready to delve into the labyrinthine mind of one of America's most complex, ruthless, and paradoxically compelling crime lords, then listen closely for the tale of James. Whitey Bulger is a descent into a heart of darkness that was nurtured, and for a long time, protected by the very forces meant to combat it. This narrative has been meticulously compiled and woven together from a vast tapestry of sources: federal court transcripts, declassified FBI files, first-hand accounts from victims and associates, deeply researched biographies, and dogged journalistic investigations. Our only goal, our sole mission, is to deliver the correct, unvarnished information to you, presenting the facts in all their grim and gritty detail. So, settle in, dim the lights, and let us begin to unravel the tangled, thorny web of a life lived in the absolute extremes of power, betrayal, and violence. The story begins not in a throne room of opulence, but in the struggling, hardscrabble, working class neighborhoods of South Boston in the years following the cataclysmic shock of the Great Depression. James Joseph Bulger Jr. entered this world on September 3, 1929, just a month before the infamous stock market crash that would plunge America into economic despair. A fittingly tumultuous beginning for a life destined for chaos. He was the second of 6 children born to James and Jane Bulger, and his childhood was marked from the outset by a harsh, defining duality. His father was a union worker who lost an arm in a devastating industrial accident, a quiet, stoic man who bore his hardship with a resigned dignity, while the streets outside the Bulger home were a chaotic, unforgiving playground of raw ambition and brutal survival. Young James, however, was not drawn to the quiet, struggling world of his father. From an exceptionally early age, his gaze was captivated by the flash, the power, and the terrifying authority of the local gangsters, the men who commanded the streets not through honest toil, but through fear, force, and a willingness to do what others would not. He formed and ran with a street gang as a boy, his first crucial foray into the ruthless ecosystem of street-level crime, learning the brutal, unwritten rules that governed life outside the law. It was here, on these mean streets, that he earned the nickname that would follow him into infamy and legend. Whitey, a seemingly innocuous reference to his shock of light, almost white, blonde hair. A name that would one day be spoken with a shudder of dread in boardrooms, police stations, and living rooms across the entire nation. This environment, the crucible of Southie, was the forge that shaped the steel of his character, a place where toughness was the only accepted currency and sentimentality was a fatal weakness he could not afford to entertain. He saw the world in stark, simplistic terms, predator and prey, and he was determined from the very beginning, from his first petty theft, never to be the latter. His early crimes were the typical portfolio of a juvenile delinquent: shoplifting, brawling, vandalism, but they were a mere prelude, a simple-scale practice, before the symphony of violence he would later conduct. These formative experiences were essential in hardening his heart, callousing his soul, and sharpening his predatory instincts for the brutal, full-time career that lay ahead. The path was set, the die was cast in the crowded, noisy streets of his youth, leading him inevitably toward his first major confrontation with the law, a confrontation that would not reform him, but would instead serve as a graduate-level education in the art of criminality. The transition from a street-level tough to a federally recognized criminal was a swift and violent one for the young Whitey Bulger. The late 1940s and the entire decade of the 1950s were his proving ground, a period where he shed the last remnants of his adolescence and fully embraced his identity as a hardened outlaw. He and a rotating cast of like-minded associates from South Boston's roughest corners turned their attention to more lucrative and dangerous pursuits, primarily the high-stakes world of armed robbery. This was not the sophisticated, electronically planned heist of modern cinema. This was brutal, direct, and terrifyingly personal. They targeted banks, loan offices, and especially armored cars, their methods defined by a cold, ruthless efficiency that quickly made them notorious within the underworld and a top priority for law enforcement. Bulger, even then, was noted for his calm demeanor during these violent acts, a chilling prelude to the ice-cold control he would later exhibit as a boss. His eyes a pale, piercing blue that would become one of his most memorable features, saw not people, but obstacles and opportunities. This life of violent crime inevitably led to a collision with the state. In 1956, after a string of successful robberies, the net finally closed. He was arrested for his involvement in a series of bank robberies, and later for the armed robbery of a Federal Reserve Bank in Indianapolis. Facing the full weight of the justice system, Bulger was convicted and handed a significant sentence, one that would see him transported to some of the most infamous penitentiaries in the United States. This was not a setback, it was an education. His first major stint was at the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta, a brutal, overcrowded institution where survival depended on a different kind of toughness than the streets of Southie demanded. It was here that he first began to systematically study, not for a degree, but for a darker purpose. He became a voracious reader, devouring books on history, philosophy, and most importantly, law. He wanted to understand the system that had captured him, to learn its rules, its weaknesses, and its loopholes. This self-education was a strategic move, a way to arm his mind with the same intensity he had previously armed his body. It was also, in this cauldron of human desperation that he first learned the intricate social codes of the prison world, the delicate and deadly dances of alliance and enmity. Following Atlanta, he was transferred to the most feared federal prison of them all, Alcatraz, the Rock. From 1959 to 1962, he was inmate number AZ-4228. Alcatraz was the end of the line, reserved for the most incorrigible offenders, and being their cemented Bulger's status in the criminal hierarchy. Life on the island was one of stark regimentation, unrelenting boredom punctuated by moments of extreme violence. He kept to himself largely, avoiding the major prison gangs and continuing his solitary studies, honing his mind into a weapon as sharp as any shiv. It was during this period that he volunteered for a controversial and highly dangerous CIA experiment involving LSD, an experience he would later claim was forced upon him and one that he suggested changed him, adding a new layer of paranoia to his already deeply suspicious nature. His time in the federal prison system, particularly Alcatraz, was transformative. It stripped away any last vestiges of impulsiveness and replaced them with a calculated, patient cunning. He was no longer just a hoodlum. He was a strategist who had been tempered in the fiercest fires the American justice system could muster. When he was finally transferred to a less secure facility and then released on parole in 1965, he was not a reformed man. He was a graduate. He returned to South Boston not as a simple ex-con, but as a seasoned veteran of the penal system, armed with a new intelligence, a formidable reputation, and a deep-seated understanding of how to manipulate the very authorities who had once imprisoned him. The boy who had left was gone. The kingpin who returned was ready to build his empire, and he would do so with a chilling new perspective on power, seeing the law not just as an enemy to be fought, but as a tool to be used and ultimately corrupted. The South Boston that Whitey Bulger returned to in 1965 was a neighborhood in the throes of social and ethnic tension. But for a man of his ambitions, chaos was merely a ladder. He did not return to a hero's welcome, but to a landscape of opportunity, a chessboard where the pieces were now moving in his favor. His first order of business was to re-establish himself, and he did so by diving headlong into the most foundational criminal enterprises of the area: loan, sharking, and bookmaking. These were not glamorous crimes, but they were the lifeblood of the underworld, providing a steady, massive cash flow and immense power over people's lives. Loan sharking, or shaylocking, was a particularly brutal and effective tool. Bulger would lend money at exorbitant interest rates, often to desperate people who had nowhere else to turn. The enforcement of repayment was where his reputation began to solidify. The stories started to circulate in hushed tones in the dimly lit bars of Southie. Tales of knees shattered with baseball bats, of teeth knocked out with pistol butts, of threats made against families. He cultivated an aura of unpredictable, calculated violence. He wasn't a hothead who flew into rages. He was a cold, dispassionate administrator of pain, a businessman for whom brutality was simply a cost of doing business. Alongside this, his bookmaking operation flourished, taking illegal bets on everything from horse races to professional sports. He understood that to control the rackets, he needed to neutralize or absorb his competition. This led him into a direct and bloody conflict with the Mullen Gang, a rival group that held sway in parts of South Boston. What followed was a brutal, low-level gang war, a series of shootings, beatings, and intimidations that painted the streets of the neighborhood with a fresh coat of fear. Bulger, through a combination of sheer ruthlessness and strategic cunning, emerged victorious, absorbing the remnants of the Mullen Gang and solidifying his control over the area's illicit gambling and loans. But Whitey's ambitions stretched beyond being a mere neighborhood boss. He set his sights on the pinnacle of organized crime in New England, the Winter Hill Gang. This was not a single, monolithic organization, but a loose confederation of Irish, American mobsters based in the nearby city of Somerville, who had united under the leadership of Howie Winter to challenge the long-standing dominance of the Italian mafia, specifically the powerful patriarcha crime family based in Providence. The Winter Hill Gang was involved in everything from truck hijackings to race fixing, and they were a force to be reckoned with. Bulger did not seek to conquer them from the outside. He sought to join and then dominate from within. He formed a crucial alliance with another ambitious and equally ruthless South Boston criminal, Stephen the Rifleman Flemmi. Flemmi was a seasoned hitman and gangster with his own formidable reputation, and together they became an unstoppable force within the Winter Hill Gang. Their rise was meteoric, fueled by a shared philosophy of absolute mercilessness. They were the enforcers, the problem solvers. When a debt needed to be collected with extreme prejudice, when a rival needed to be permanently silenced, Bulger and Flemmi were the ones called upon. They were not just members. They were the sharpened teeth of the organization. This period saw the beginning of Bulger's direct involvement in murder, a line he crossed without apparent hesitation or remorse. The gang's activities expanded into sophisticated large-scale rackets, most famously a massive race fixing scheme at the race tracks in New England and New York. They bribed jockeys, tampered with horses, and manipulated odds, netting millions of dollars. It was during this ascent within the Winter Hill Gang that Bulger's path intersected with an institution that would become both his greatest shield and his ultimate undoing, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. A young, ambitious FBI agent named John Connolly, himself a charismatic son of South Boston, was assigned to the Boston office's organized crime squad. Connolly saw in Bulger and Flemmi a golden opportunity. The FBI's national priority at the time was dismantling the Italian mafia, La Cosa Nostra. Connolly approached his childhood acquaintance, Whitey Bulger, with a proposition that would change the course of criminal history in Boston. Become top echelon informants for the FBI, provide intelligence on the Patriarcha family, and in return, the FBI would protect them from prosecution and allow them to eliminate their criminal competition. For Bulger, a man who had studied the system from within Alcatraz, this was not a moral dilemma. It was the ultimate strategic coup. He saw it for what it was, a license to operate, a get out of jail-free card handed to him by the very government that had once locked him away. He and Flemmy agreed, and with a handshake that would seal the fates of countless individuals, one of the most corrupt and devastating alliances in American law enforcement history was born. The deal struck with Agent John Connolly was not a mere agreement. It was a dark baptism, anointing James Whitey Bulger with a form of invincibility that transformed him from a powerful gangster into a near mythological demon haunting the city of Boston. This unholy alliance, brokered in the mid-1970s, operated under a simple, devastatingly effective premise. Bulger and his partner, Stephen Flemmy, would provide the FBI with information on the activities of the Italian mafia, the Patriarca crime family, which was the Bureau's primary target. In return, Connolly, and by extension the FBI, would not only shield them from prosecution, but would actively work to eliminate their rivals, effectively using the full force of the federal government as a weapon in a gang war. This arrangement gave Bulger what every criminal dreams of: a permanent, early warning system. He was now privy to the innermost workings of the investigations aimed at him. If a wiretap was to be placed, Connolly would warn him. If an undercover agent was sniffing around his territory, Connolly would tip him off. If a state police task force or a rival agency was building a case, Bulger would know about it long before any arrests could be made. This flow of information was a two-way street of corruption. Bulger, ever the strategist, quickly learned to weaponize the intelligence he received. He would feed Connolly information, often accurate, sometimes fabricated, about his competitors, painting them as threats to the FBI's operations or as uncooperative snitches within the mafia, leading to their arrests and indictments. One by one, the rivals who stood between Bulger and total dominance of Boston's underworld began to fall, not to his bullets, but to federal indictments delivered by his handlers. This period marked the zenith of Bulger's power and the beginning of his most brutal reign, with the mafia being systematically dismantled by the FBI with his help, and his non-Italian competitors being conveniently removed by the same force. Bulger's Winter Hill Gang, now effectively under his and Flemmy's control, became the unchallenged criminal organization in Boston. This unchecked power unleashed the most savage aspects of his character. The murders, which had before been strategic eliminations of direct threats, now became more frequent, more casual, and more horrifyingly arbitrary. He operated with the confidence of a man who believed he was above the law because, in a very real sense, he was. The basement of a South Boston liquor store owned by his gang became a preferred torture chamber and execution site. Victims would be lured there under false pretenses, often with a promise of a sit-down or a business meeting, only to be confronted by Bulger and his associates. The methods were unspeakable, prolonged torture, strangulation with ropes, point-blank gunshots to the head. Among the most chilling of these victims were two young women, Deborah Davis and Deborah Hussey. Davis was Flemmy's girlfriend, whom he suspected was going to become a liability. She was strangled to death, and her body was disposed of. Hussey was the stepdaughter of Flemmy, and her murder was equally brutal, a grim testament to the fact that no one was safe, not even those within the inner circle's own families. Bulger's relationship with Connolly was meticulously managed. He paid the agent generously with cash, filled envelopes, often handed over in cars or in shadowy corners. But the currency was not just money, it was also loyalty, a perverse bond forged in the shared soil of South Boston, and a mutual ambition. Connolly, in turn, protected his prized asset fiercely within the Bureau, portraying Bulger as the most valuable informant in the history of the Boston office, a man who was single-handedly decimating the mafia. He shielded Bulger from other, more honest agents who grew suspicious, and he actively corrupted other law enforcement officials to maintain the facade. This protection allowed Bulger to expand his empire beyond traditional rackets into the burgeoning and immensely profitable world of cocaine and marijuana trafficking in the 1980s, a move that even some of his old school associates frowned upon but were powerless to stop. He became a ghost, a specter that everyone knew was there, whose influence was felt in every extorted business and on every terrorized street corner, yet who remained utterly untouchable. He would hold court in his various haunts, like the Triple O's Lounge or the Rotary Liquor Store, a calm, almost paternal figure who could, in one moment, buy a round of drinks for the house, and in the next, coldly order the execution of a man he had known for years. This was the duality of the demon, the ability to project a folksy, neighborhood image while his hands were perpetually soaked in blood that the FBI, through its most trusted agent, was helping him wash away. The fortress of power that Whitey Bulger had constructed, with its walls reinforced by FBI corruption, seemed impregnable throughout the 1980s. But even the most carefully laid plans of a demon king are susceptible to the slow, inexorable pressures of time, ambition, and human error. The first significant cracks in his empire did not come from an external police force, but from within the very criminal ecosystem he dominated. The insatiable greed that fueled his expansion into large-scale drug trafficking, a venture he had once publicly condemned, began to create a trail of bodies and a chorus of whispers that even his protector, John Connolly, could not fully silence. While Bulger presented himself to his South Boston constituents as a principled outlaw who kept hard drugs out of the neighborhood, a Robin Hood figure of sorts, he was simultaneously orchestrating multi-million-dollar shipments of cocaine and marijuana, partnering with a new, more volatile generation of criminals. This hypocrisy was not lost on those within his orbit, and it bred resentment and dangerous loose ends. Associates who knew too much about the drug operations or who were perceived as potential informants began to disappear with alarming regularity, their fates serving as a grim reminder of the cost of disloyalty or mere inconvenience. One of the most pivotal internal threats came from a member of his own crew, a man named Brian Halloran. Halloran, a low-level gangster and drug dealer, had direct knowledge of several Bulger orchestrated murders, including the brutal killing of a World GI executive named Roger Wheeler, a Tulsa businessman whom Bulger had ordered assassinated because he suspected Wheeler was getting too close to his skimming operation at the front end in Connecticut. Feeling the heat from a federal investigation and fearing he would be the next to be silenced, Halloran made a desperate gamble. He decided to become an informant for the FBI. This was a direct challenge to Bulger's sanctity, a move that struck at the heart of his protected status. Halloran specifically told his FBI handlers that it was Whitey Bulger who was behind the Wheeler murder and other killings. But the FBI's Boston office was a house divided, a nest of competing ambitions and corrupted loyalties. The information from Halloran, instead of being acted upon with urgency, was funneled directly to John Connolly. Connolly, in a move that would later be seen as one of the most egregious betrayals of the FBI's mandate, immediately alerted Bulger. The consequence was swift and merciless. Bulger, knowing he had to act decisively to eliminate this threat, orchestrated a public and brazen assassination. In May 1982, as Brian Halloran left a waterfront restaurant in South Boston, a gunman opened fire with an automatic rifle, cutting him down in a hail of bullets on a public street. An innocent bystander, an electrician named Michael Donahue, who had offered Halloran a ride, was also killed in the ambush. The message was chillingly clear. Even speaking to the FBI was a death sentence, because the FBI itself was compromised. This murder, carried out with such cold-blooded efficiency, demonstrated the absolute power of the Bulger-Connolly axis. Yet, it also raised the stakes impossibly high. Each murder committed under the FBI's protective umbrella was another thread in a noose that was slowly, imperceptibly tightening. The sheer number of bodies, the growing list of missing associates, and the brazenness of the violence began to attract attention from outside Connolly's sphere of influence. The Massachusetts State Police, in particular, had long been suspicious of Bulger's inexplicable immunity. A dogged and determined state police detective named Bob Long made Bulger his personal obsession, building cases against him for loan sharking and extortion, only to find his investigations mysteriously stalled, his witnesses intimidated, and his efforts undermined by what he could only assume was a leak at the highest levels. This created a silent, shadow war between the state police and the FBI, a war where the honest cops were fighting not just the mob, but their federal counterparts. Furthermore, the internal dynamics of the Winter Hill Gang were shifting. The original leader, Howie Winter, was in prison, and Bulger's rule, while absolute, was resented by some of the old guard who saw his methods as too flashy and his alliance with the FBI as a dangerous game. This internal friction, combined with the external pressure from a handful of honest investigators who refused to look away, meant that the foundation of Bulger's kingdom, though still standing strong, was beginning to tremble. The demon was still in his castle, but the villagers were no longer just afraid. Some were now armed with a desperate courage, and the walls, though fortified by corruption, were not made of stone, but of secrets, and secrets, as Bulger was soon to learn, have a finite shelf life. The turning of the tide against James, Bulger was not a sudden tsunami, but a slow, creeping tide of consequence that began to erode the shores of his impunity as the 1980s drew to a close. The very machinery of corruption that had protected him for so long began to develop fatal flaws, its gears grinding against the stubborn, unyielding integrity of a few individuals who refused to surrender the city to his shadow rule. The first and most significant breach in his armor came from an unexpected quarter: the internal politics and shifting priorities of the Federal Bureau of Investigation itself. For years, John Connolly had successfully portrayed Bulger and Stephen Flemmi as golden assets, their value in the war against the Italian mafia outweighing any of their local criminal misdeeds in the eyes of his superiors. But as the Gennaro Angelo led faction of the Patriarca family was successfully convicted and imprisoned in 1986, largely with the help of the intelligence provided by Bulger, a pressing question began to be asked by a new generation of FBI agents and federal prosecutors. What was the continued justification for protecting these men? The primary target was gone. Yet the informants remained, thriving and killing with an audacity that was becoming an open secret. This question gained a powerful voice in the form of a relentless federal prosecutor named Jeremiah O'Sullivan, the head of the New England Organized Crime Strike Force. O'Sullivan, who had himself used information from Bulger to build his mafia cases, began to see the duo not as assets, but as the last great untouchable targets of organized crime in Boston. He started authorizing investigations aimed directly at the Winter Hill Gang, creating a direct conflict within the law enforcement community. Simultaneously, the dogged efforts of the Massachusetts State Police, particularly the troopers under Lieutenant Bob Long, were finally gaining traction. Long and his team, operating with a meticulous, old-school dedication, had managed to flip a key Bulger associate, a man named John McIntyre. McIntyre was a boat captain and drug smuggler who had been involved in several of Bulger's large-scale narcotics shipments, including a disastrous attempt to bring weapons to the Irish Republican Army aboard the fishing trawler Valhalla. Facing arrest, McIntyre, like Brian Halloran before him, decided to talk. He provided the state police with a treasure trove of information, detailing the inner workings of Bulger's drug empire, his money laundering schemes, and, most damningly, his involvement in multiple murders. The state police, wary of the FBI, took this information to the Drug Enforcement Administration, another federal agency that was not under Connolly's influence. This was a deliberate end, run around the corruption, and it worked. A joint DEA and state police task force began building a powerful case, with John McIntyre as their star witness. But the dark hand of the protected world intervened once more. John Connolly, alerted to McIntyre's cooperation, informed Bulger. The result was another entry in Bulger's long ledger of death. In November 1984, McIntyre was lured to a house in South Boston, where he was interrogated by Bulger and Flemmi. They confronted him with his cooperation, and in a final, brutal act, Bulger tortured the man before putting a bullet in his head. His body was buried in a shallow grave, joining the growing secret graveyard of Bulger's victims. This pattern repeated itself, a sickening cycle. A potential witness would emerge. Connolly would be warned. Bulger would eliminate the threat. But each murder, while solving an immediate problem, added more weight to the case that was slowly, painstakingly being assembled by his enemies. The pressure was building on all fronts. A federal grand jury was now actively investigating Bulger's organization, and subpoenas were flying. Even more dangerously for Bulger, the Internal Affairs Division of the FBI, known as the Office of Professional Responsibility, had begun to take an interest in the rumors swirling around John Connolly and his prized informants. The carefully constructed narrative of Bulger the valuable asset was crumbling, replaced by the emerging truth of Bulger the protected monster. The atmosphere around Bulger grew increasingly paranoid. He knew the walls were closing in, that the once impenetrable shield of the FBI was cracking. He began to suspect everyone, his icy calm giving way to flashes of the feral violence that lay beneath. The world he had ruled for nearly 2 decades was becoming a cage, and the keepers of that cage, the federal government, were now divided between those who had enabled him and those who were determined to see him in prison. The final catalyst for his downfall would come from within his own criminal family, a betrayal that would shatter the foundation of his operation and send him running for his life, transforming him from an untouchable kingpin into America's most wanted. The House of Cards, so meticulously built on a foundation of blood and corruption, finally began its irrevocable collapse in the early 1990s, not with a bang, but with the dry, procedural rustle of legal papers in a distant courtroom. The end for Whitey Bulger began not on the streets of Boston, but in Miami, Florida, where his partner in crime and fellow FBI informant, Stephen the Rifleman Flemmi, was arrested on federal racketeering charges in 1990. This arrest was different. It was not a case built by the compromised Boston FBI office, but by a task force that included the DEA and other agencies, and it was part of a broader, multi-state indictment targeting the remnants of the Winter Hill Gang. Flemmi, confident in the protection he had enjoyed for nearly 2 decades, believed this was a minor inconvenience. He assumed his handler, John Connolly, would soon intervene, the charges would be softened, and he would be released. He was wrong. The legal and institutional landscape had shifted dramatically. The old guard at the FBI that had tolerated Connolly's methods was being replaced. More importantly, the federal prosecutors now held all the cards and were in no mood to deal. They offered Flemmi a stark choice: cooperate fully and testify against his associates, including Bulger, or face the rest of his life in prison. Flemmi, a hardened killer who had lived by a code of silence, initially refused. But as the reality of his situation sank in, the mountain of evidence, the testimony of other turned gangsters, and the chilling absence of his FBI lifeline, his resolve began to crack. The dam truly broke, however, when the federal prosecutors, now led by a determined attorney named Fred Wishak, made a strategic masterstroke. They began to subpoena the FBI's own files on their informants, Bulger and Flemmi. This forced the Bureau to confront the corruption within its own ranks in an open courtroom. As FBI agents were compelled to testify, the sordid details of the relationship between Connolly, Bulger, and Flemmi began to spill into the public record, the defense of being valuable informants was eviscerated when it was revealed that much of the information they provided was outdated, inaccurate, or designed solely to eliminate their rivals. The true nature of their deal was laid bare. It was not a law enforcement strategy. It was a criminal partnership. Facing this onslaught, Flemmi's legal team decided on a nuclear option. They filed a motion claiming that the government, through the FBI, had given their client and Bulger immunity for all their crimes, including murder, as part of their deal to be informants. This immunity defense was a legal Hail Mary, but it had a devastating side effect. In the pretrial hearings to argue this motion, every gruesome detail of their reign of terror was exposed in open court. The murders of Deborah Davis and Deborah Hussey, the execution of Roger Wheeler, the torture of John McIntyre, all of it was now part of the official transcript, no longer a street rumor, but a matter of federal law. The public, and more importantly, the national media, was horrified. The story was no longer just about gangsters. It was about a scandal of epic proportions within the FBI. As Flemmi sat in court and heard his own life of murder and betrayal detailed by prosecutors, he realized the game was over. The protection was gone, and his only path to avoiding a death sentence was to make a deal. He began to negotiate, offering to testify against everyone, from his former underlings to the FBI agents who had protected him. The noose was tightening, and it was now closing around the neck of James, Whitey Bulger. Bulger, ever the predator, sensed the shift in the wind long before the official warnings came. He saw the indictments, the news reports, and the sudden silence from his once reliable contacts. He knew that Flemmi, under the pressure of a life sentence, would inevitably break and become the star witness against him. The world he had ruled for so long was now a trap. In December 1994, a federal judge, after reviewing the evidence, issued a secret indictment against Bulger for a raft of crimes, including multiple counts of murder. A warrant was prepared for his arrest. The FBI was finally officially coming for its own informant. On January 4, 1995, John Connolly, in what would be his final act of service to his criminal master, managed to get a warning to Bulger. The story goes that Connolly simply told Bulger's longtime companion, Catherine Gregg, to tell Whitey to get lost. It was a vague but urgent signal, one that Bulger understood immediately. He withdrew a large amount of cash from his hidden stashes, packed a bag, and with Catherine Gregg by his side, he walked out of his South Boston world and vanished into the thin, cold air of a New England winter. He was 65 years old, and he was now a fugitive, leaving behind a city in shock and a legacy of terror and corruption that would take decades to fully unravel. The disappearance of James, Whitey Bulger in early 1995 marked the beginning of a new and bizarre chapter in his already monstrous legacy, transforming him from a local terror into a national specter and a symbol of the FBI's most profound failure. His flight was not a panicked, disorganized scramble, but the calculated maneuver of a man who had been preparing for this possibility for years. A man who understood the mechanics of hiding better than most. He and Catherine Gregg slipped away from Boston not as wealthy kingpins, but as a seemingly ordinary, aging couple, leveraging the very anonymity that his former notoriety made so difficult to achieve. The initial investigation into his whereabouts was a tangled mess, hampered by embarrassment, institutional shame, and the lingering effects of the very corruption that had enabled him. For years, the FBI's pursuit seemed half-hearted, almost perfunctory, leading to widespread speculation and conspiracy theories. Many in Boston believed the FBI was letting him go, that a quiet deal had been struck to avoid the further embarrassment of a public trial that would expose the depth of their corruption. The truth was likely a combination of bureaucratic incompetence and a fundamental misjudgment of the man they were hunting. The FBI assumed he would flee to the old country, to Ireland, where he had connections and could blend in more easily, or to some other exotic locale. They flooded Europe with wanted posters and Interpol notices, while the trail within the United States grew cold. This misdirection was precisely what Bulger, a creature of habit and control, would have wanted. He did not seek a life of luxury on a foreign beach. He sought invisibility, and he found it not in a distant land, but in the heart of his own country. For the first several years, he and Gregg lived a nomadic existence, drifting from one cheap motel to another across the American South and Southwest, always paying in cash, never staying in one place for more than a few weeks. They used aliases, but not the elaborate, forged identity legends of spy novels. They were simply Mark and Carol Shackleton, a retired couple from the Midwest. Their existence was one of profound isolation and paranoia. Bulger, the man who had once held court in busy bars, now spent his days in silent, air-conditioned rooms, his world reduced to the four walls of a budget suite, the glow of a television, and the constant, gnawing fear of a knock at the door. He grew a beard, dyed his famous white hair, and wore glasses, a simple but effective disguise that softened the hard, angular features so familiar to law enforcement. Catherine Gregg's role was crucial. She handled the mundane tasks of life that could create a trail: shopping, renting apartments, dealing with landlords, while Bulger remained hidden, a ghost in the daylight. He occupied his mind by reading voraciously, as he had in prison, consuming history books and true crime, perhaps even studying the methods of other fugitives. He wrote long, rambling letters to old associates, which he never sent, filled with justifications for his actions and bitter denunciations of those he felt had betrayed him, especially Stephen Fleming and the FBI. This was the psychological toll of his flight. The king had become a prisoner, not of steel bars, but of his own mind and his dwindling options. The money, the millions he had stashed away, was both a lifeline and a curse. It allowed him to survive, but he could not access it freely or make large withdrawals without drawing attention. They lived frugally, their lifestyle belying the fortune he supposedly possessed. As the years turned into a decade, and then more, they sought a more permanent form of hiding. They settled for a time in Chicago, and then, in a final, ironic twist, they moved to the one place that represented the ultimate hiding, in plain sight, Southern California. They found a home in a quiet, unassuming apartment complex in Santa Monica, a stone's throw from the bustling beaches and tourist crowds. Here, Charlie and Carol Gasco became reclusive neighbors, the friendly but distant older couple in Unit 303. They had a small dog, and Greg would be seen taking it for walks, sometimes visiting the beauty parlor, while Bulger, now in his 80s, was rarely seen, his existence confined mostly to their dim, cluttered apartment. He had a collection of books, a stack of cash hidden in the walls, and a simmering rage that had nowhere to go. The world outside moved on. The 1990s ended, a new millennium began, and the memory of Whitey Bulger began to fade from the national consciousness, relegated to occasional true crime documentaries and dusty FBI files. He was becoming a ghost in truth, a historical footnote, his fate one of America's enduring mysteries. But the consequences of his life of crime were still playing out in courtrooms back in Boston, and the relentless pursuit of a few dedicated individuals ensured that the hunt for the demon of Southie was not yet over, while James, Whitey Bulger cultivated his fragile anonymity in the sun-bleached confinement of Santa Monica. The world he had fled was systematically dismantling his legacy and inching ever closer to his hidden doorstep. The legal reckoning he had escaped began in earnest without him, a sprawling, multi-decade judicial process that laid bare the full, horrifying scope of his crimes and the corrosive corruption that had enabled them. The first to fall was his protector, FBI agent John Connolly, in 1999. After years of investigation by federal prosecutors and the FBI's own Office of Professional Responsibility, Connolly was indicted on federal racketeering charges, not for corruption, but for his direct role in the criminal enterprise itself. The indictment painted a devastating picture. Connolly was not just a corrupt agent, he was a de facto member of the Winter Hill Gang, an accomplice who used his badge and authority to facilitate murder and mayhem. The trial was a media sensation, a cathartic public airing of the FBI's dirty laundry. Witness after witness, including a now cooperative Stephen Flemmi, detailed how Connolly had provided the bulletproof shield behind which Bulger operated. Flemmi testified that Connolly had warned them about wiretaps, identified informants like Brian Holloran and John McIntyre, and even tipped them off about the specific questions that would be asked in grand jury proceedings. The most chilling testimony involved the murder of John McIntyre. Flemmi stated that after Connolly confirmed McIntyre was talking, Bulger had said, "High's going to have to be killed." Connolly was convicted in 2002 and sentenced to 10 years in prison, a sentence that many felt was shockingly lenient for his role in multiple murders. But the justice system was not finished with him. In 2008, he was tried in Florida for his involvement in the 1982 murder of a former World Jai Allah executive, John Callahan, a killing orchestrated by Bulger to silence a potential witness. Connolly was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 40 years, ensuring the man who had been the architect of Bulger's impunity, would likely die behind bars. Meanwhile, Stephen Flemmi, in a desperate bid to avoid the death penalty, had fully embraced his role as a government witness. He began to talk, and he talked for hundreds of hours, providing prosecutors with a guided tour of the underworld's darkest corners. His cooperation was a double-edged sword for the government. While it provided the evidence needed to convict numerous corrupt officials and lesser gangsters, it also forced the Department of Justice to confront an uncomfortable truth: Flemmi's immunity defense. The claim that the FBI had granted him and Bulger a license to kill led a federal judge to make a landmark ruling. The judge found that the government, through the FBI, had acted with outrageousness, and that its conduct had been so egregious that it was, in fact, partially responsible for the murders of individuals like Deborah Davis and Deborah Hussey, as their status as informants had allowed Bulger and Flemmi to operate without fear. This finding did not absolve the killers, but it opened the floodgates for multi-million-dollar civil lawsuits from the families of the victims against the federal government, a stunning official condemnation of the FBI's actions. As these legal battles raged, the hunt for Bulger himself was revitalized. The old, complacent theories were discarded. A new generation of FBI agents, untainted by the past scandals, took over the case. They shifted their focus, believing he was still in the United States. They re-interviewed everyone, followed new leads on the money trail, and most importantly, launched a massive public awareness campaign. In 2008, the FBI featured Bulger prominently on its revamped America's Most Wanted television series, and in 2011, they took the unprecedented step of launching a nationwide ad campaign, specifically targeting women who might have interacted with Catherine Gregg. They plastered her picture in beauty salons and doctors' offices across the country, emphasizing her distinctive features and her love for small dogs. They offered a $2 million reward for information, leading to Bulger's capture, and a separate $100,000 reward just for information on Gregg. This was a psychological masterstroke, targeting the one person who had been with Bulger for 16 years. The one person he depended on for his connection to the outside world. The pressure was building. The net was being cast wider and with a finer mesh, and thousands of miles away, in a small apartment by the beach, the invisible walls that had protected Charlie and Carol Gasco for so long were about to be shattered by a single, attentive neighbor who had seen the news. The meticulously constructed facade of Charlie and Carol Gasco crumbled not with a dramatic confrontation, but with the quiet hum of a television set in a neighboring apartment and the sharp, observant eyes of a woman named Anna Jornsdottir. For 16 years, the fugitives had maintained their cover through an almost monastic discipline of anonymity. But the FBI's renewed and highly specific public campaign, focusing intently on the habits and appearance of Catherine Gregg, created a ripple that finally reached their quiet corner of Santa Monica. The key was the emphasis on Gregg's documented affection for small dogs and her frequent visits to beauty salons. to maintain her blonde hair. In the summer of 2011, a neighbor in the Princess Eugenia apartment complex, who had known the reclusive couple for years as quiet and unassuming neighbors, began to connect the dots. The woman, Carol, bore a striking resemblance to the aged photographs of Catherine Gregg that were now being splashed across true crime shows and news segments. She had a small, fluffy dog that she doted on. She was meticulous about her appearance, and her companion, the man known as Charlie, was almost never seen, a ghost in his own home. The neighbor, unsettled by the growing suspicion, did what thousands of Americans were being urged to do. She contacted the FBI. This single tip, one among thousands that the task force had sifted through for years, immediately stood out. It was specific, it was contemporary, and it perfectly matched the behavioral profile the Bureau had so publicly outlined. The Los Angeles FBI field office, now on high alert, began a low-key but intense surveillance operation on the modest three-story apartment building at 12 3rd Street. For days, agents watched the comings and goings, confirming the presence of an elderly woman who matched Gregg's description. They observed the routine, the walks with the small dog, the errands run alone. The challenge was confirming the identity of the man, the elusive Charlie. They needed a clear photograph to compare with their aging software projections of what an 81-year-old Whitey Bulger would look like. The breakthrough came when an agent, using a long lens camera from a discreet location, managed to capture a fleeting image of the man inside the apartment. It was him. The sharp, angular jawline, the piercing pale eyes, the distinctive ears. Age and a beard could not conceal the face that had haunted Boston for decades. The ghost had been given a body and an address. On June 23, 2011, after carefully planning the operation to avoid any potential violence or chance of escape, a heavily armed FBI SWAT team converged on the building. The scene was surreal, a jarring collision of two vastly different worlds: the tranquil, sun-drenched California normality of palm trees and beachgoers, and the grim, determined machinery of federal justice arriving to collect a debt 16 years overdue. The team approached Unit 303. There was no dramatic standoff, no hail of bullets. The door was buzzed open, perhaps by a confused Catherine Gregg, and the agents swarmed inside. They found Bulger in the back bedroom, unarmed and offering no resistance. The man who had once commanded an army of thugs and corrupted the halls of power was now a frail, old man in a disheveled apartment, surrounded by stacks of cash, overall 800 Zalos in hidden compartments, and a small arsenal of weapons that he had no opportunity to use. His capture was shockingly anticlimactic, a quiet surrender that belied the violent tumult of his life. As he was handcuffed, his only reported question was a plaintive, "What took you so long?" A statement layered with a lifetime of arrogance, irony, and perhaps a touch of relief that the exhausting game of cat and mouse was finally over. Catherine Gregg was arrested alongside him. The news exploded across the nation, a stunning conclusion to one of the longest and most embarrassing manhunts in FBI history. The demon of Southie had been found not in a fortified compound, but in a rent, controlled apartment a few blocks from the beach, living a life of paranoid monotony. His empire reduced to a few rooms cluttered with the dusty relics of his infamy. The capture was not an end, but a beginning, the start of a final, definitive act that would transport him back to the city he had terrorized and fled, to face a judgment that had been delayed but never forgotten. The cross-country journey of James Whitey Bulger from a California jail cell to a federal detention center in Boston was a media circus, a perp walk on a national stage, but it was merely the prelude to the main event, a trial that was less a legal proceeding and more a cathartic exorcism for the city of Boston. The federal government, determined to finally secure a conviction and bury the ghost of its own corruption, prepared a case of monumental proportions. The 2013 trial was not about a handful of crimes. It was an archaeological dig into a 40-year reign of terror, a sprawling indictment that charged the 83-year-old Bulger with 35 separate criminal counts, including his central role in 19 murders, along with racketeering, extortion, money laundering, and arms dealing. The prosecution, led by the relentless Fred Washak and Brian Kelly, assembled a witness list that read like a who's who of the Boston underworld, a parade of aging, broken gangsters, hitmen, and former associates who had all cut deals to save themselves. The strategy was simple: to bury Bulger under an avalanche of testimony so vast, so detailed, and so corroborated that his guilt would become an undeniable, historical fact. The defense, led by the court-appointed attorney J. Carney Jr., faced a Herculean task. Their client was insisting on a bizarre and ultimately self-destructive strategy. Bulger vehemently denied being an FBI informant despite the overwhelming evidence, including his own meticulously kept files that had been found in his Santa Monica apartment. He claimed that John Connolly had fabricated the informant reports and that his relationship with the FBI was not one of snitching, but of paying bribes for protection. A distinction without a difference in the eyes of the law, but a matter of profound personal pride to the aging gangster. This insistence hamstrung his own defense, as it prevented his lawyers from fully pursuing the one potentially mitigating argument available to them, that the government was so complicit in his crimes that a full and fair prosecution was impossible. Instead, the trial became a grim, methodical recitation of horror. For weeks, the courtroom listened to gruesome, first-hand accounts of murder. Stephen, the rifleman, Flemmy, now a frail old man in prison garb, took the stand and in a chilling, matter-of-fact monotone, pointed across the room at his former partner and detailed their killings together. He described the murder of Deborah Hussey, his own stepdaughter, with a coldness that stunned the courtroom, stating that Bulger had placed a rope around her neck and strangled her as Flemmy held her down. Other former associates, like John Martorano, a confessed hitman who had admitted to 20 murders, calmly explained how he, Bulger, and Flemmy had executed their victims, often in the basements of social clubs or in the trunks of cars. The prosecutors displayed graphic crime scene and autopsy photographs, forcing the jury and the public to confront the brutal reality behind the gangster legend. Through it all, Bulger sat at the defense table, a sphinx-like figure, often appearing disinterested, sometimes scribbling notes, his face a mask that rarely betrayed emotion. He was witnessing the complete demolition of his own carefully constructed myth. The image of the principled outlaw, the Robin Hood of Southie, was eviscerated by the testimony of his own accomplices, revealing him instead as a man who killed women, who tortured associates, who betrayed everyone for his own gain. The defense's case was brief and largely ineffectual, limited to examining the government's witnesses to highlight their own depravity and the sweetheart deals they had received for their testimony. Bulger himself, against the advice of his lawyers, chose not to take the stand in his own defense, a final, cowardly retreat from the spotlight he had once craved. He would not subject himself to the humiliation of cross-examination, to having his own lies and self-justifications dismantled under oath. After 5 days of deliberation, the jury returned with its verdicts. They found him guilty on 30, one of the 32 counts they considered, including complicity in 11 of the 19 murders. It was a complete and total victory for the prosecution. As the verdicts were read, a wave of quiet relief mixed with unresolved grief washed over the courtroom. Families of the victims, who had waited for decades for this moment, wept silently. The long, dark shadow that James, Whitey Bulger had cast over Boston for half a century had finally been lifted by the sober, bright light of the law. The kingpin was now simply prisoner number Yo492-748, awaiting a final sentencing that would formally consign him to the oblivion he had so richly earned. The sentencing of James, Whitey Bulger in November of 2013 was less a judicial formality and more a ritual of communal reckoning. A final, formal opportunity for the voices he had silenced to ring out in a room where he was now powerless to stop them. The proceeding was presided over by Judge Denise Casper, and the atmosphere was thick with a pent-up decades-old anguish demanding to be heard. The prosecution, having secured a landslide conviction, argued for the maximum possible sentence, painting a portrait of Bulger as a voracious predator whose life was a monument to greed, betrayal, and senseless violence. They presented evidence of his vast, hidden wealth, contrasting it with the poverty of the neighborhoods he claimed to champion, and detailed the cold, mechanical efficiency with which he had ordered and participated in the extinction of human lives. But the true weight of the day was carried not by the lawyers, but by the families of the murdered, who stood one by one before the court to deliver their victim impact statements. These were not legal arguments. They were raw, unfiltered outpourings of grief, rage, and a lifetime of stolen potential. They spoke of sons and brothers, fathers and husbands, who had been taken from them, their bodies often hidden, their fates a mystery for years, leaving behind a torturous void of unanswered questions. One after another, they faced the old man at the defense table, their words lashing him with a moral force far greater than any prison sentence could ever be. They spoke of weddings he had missed, of grandchildren he would never meet, of empty chairs at holiday tables that served as a perpetual, painful reminder of his cruelty. They called him a monster, a coward, a soulless demon. They recounted the grueling decades of knowing he was free, living his life while their loved ones were in the ground, an injustice that had festered like an open wound. Through it all, Bulger remained characteristically stoic, his face an impassive mask, occasionally shaking his head in dismissive gestures that only served to underscore the profound disconnect between his self-perception and the reality of the devastation he had wrought. He seemed to be listening not to the pain of his victims, but for some perceived flaw in the procedure, some technicality that might still save him. When given his own chance to speak, he declined, a final act of defiance and cowardice that spoke volumes. He would not apologize. He would not explain. He would not even acknowledge the humanity of the people whose lives he had shattered. This silence was his last, fitting testament. Judge Casper, before delivering the sentence, methodically dismantled the last vestiges of his mythology. She stated that his crimes were almost beyond comprehension, and that his unabated commitment to violence had left a trail of suffering that was as tragic as it was extensive. She noted that his age was not a mitigating factor, but rather it highlighted the sheer duration of his malevolence. Then came the final, formal pronouncement. For the racketeering charges that encompassed his life of crime, he was sentenced to life in prison. For the specific crimes of murder, extortion, and money laundering, he received consecutive life sentences. And for the federal weapons charges, he received a 5-year sentence. The totality of the sentencing meant that James, Whitey Bulger, was condemned to die in prison, with no possibility of parole, no chance of ever breathing free air again. He was, in the eyes of the state, already a ghost. As the marshals led him away, the sense of closure in the courtroom was palpable, but it was a bittersweet victory. No sentence, no matter how long, could bring back the dead or erase the decades of pain. The justice was procedural, not restorative. Bulger was first sent to the United States Penitentiary in Tucson, Arizona, a high-security facility designed to hold the most dangerous and disruptive inmates. His notoriety made him a target, and for his own protection, he was quickly transferred to another facility, eventually finding a permanent, final home at the United States Penitentiary Coleman II in Sumterville, Florida, a fortress of concrete and steel that housed other infamous criminals. He was placed in the general population, a decision that would later be scrutinized, but for now, the story seemed to be over. The demon had been captured, tried, convicted, and caged. The book, it appeared, was finally closed. The city of Boston could begin to move on. The long, dark chapter of his reign seemingly at an end. But the story of Whitey Bulger, a narrative so saturated with violence and betrayal, had one last shocking twist to deliver, a final, brutal act that would ensure his name would not fade quietly into the annals of crime history, but would instead be etched there with a final, bloody flourish. The final, brutal coda to the life of James, Whitey Bulger arrived not in a courtroom, but in the grim, gray confines of his prison cell, a setting that was both an end in itself and a stage for one last act of violence. His transfer to the United States Penitentiary Coleman II in Florida had placed him within a population of hardened criminals, many of whom were decades younger and saw the 89-year-old gangster not as a fearsome legend, but as a vulnerable target, a trophy whose demise could bring instant notoriety within the brutal hierarchy of the prison system. The Bureau of Prisons, in a decision that would later be condemned as grossly negligent, had placed the frail, wheelchair-using Bulger in the general population of a facility known for its violence, despite his age, his health problems, and his immense notoriety, which made him a magnet for trouble. On the morning of October 30, 2018, just hours after his arrival at USP Coleman, having been transferred from a facility in Oklahoma, the inevitable occurred. He was found brutally beaten to death in his cell. The details that emerged were as savage as they were symbolic. He had been attacked with a padlock stuffed inside a sock, a crude but devastating weapon known as a lock in a sock, and his body showed evidence of massive trauma, including the near removal of his eyes. It was a death of extreme violence, a fate he had delivered to so many others, now visited upon him with a poetic, horrifying finality. The news of his murder sent a final shockwave through the public consciousness. The man who had cheated justice for so long, who had been protected by the FBI, who had lived 16 years as a fugitive, and who had finally been caged for his crimes, had now been subjected to the very kind of extralegal execution he had once mastered. 3 men were eventually identified as suspects in the killing, all with ties to organized crime, and one, Fochios Freddy, Geese, a Massachusetts hitman serving a life sentence for murdering a mobster, was widely believed to be the mastermind. The motive was layered and murky, a toxic brew of prison politics, personal vendettas, and the dark currency of reputation. Some speculated it was retribution for his status as an FBI informant, the ultimate sin in the criminal underworld, a stain that Geese, a man who despised rats, would have been eager to erase with violence. Others suggested it was a simple power grab, a way for a younger generation of criminals to cement their status by taking down a fallen king. The irony was profound and inescapable. The man who had built his entire empire on the foundation of being a stand-up guy, who had clung to the myth of his own honor, even as he was betraying everyone around him to the FBI, had ultimately been destroyed by the very code he had so publicly championed and so privately violated. His death, while gruesome, brought little sense of justice to the families of his victims. For many, it was a hollow, unsatisfying end. They were robbed of the slow, quiet suffering of a life spent in a cage, the gradual fading away that they felt he deserved. His violent exit felt too quick, too dramatic, too much like the gangster movie finale he might have secretly envisioned for himself, rather than the monotonous, ignominious obscurity of old age in a prison infirmary. The federal government launched an investigation, not into the murder itself, but into the circumstances that led to it, questioning the Bureau of Prisons' decision making process that placed such a high-profile, vulnerable inmate directly in harm's way almost immediately upon his arrival. Conspiracy theories, never far from any event in Bulger's life, flourished once more. Some wondered if the transfer to Coleman was a deliberate setup, a way for someone, perhaps within the system itself, to ensure that Bulger would never lie, to potentially reveal more damaging secrets about the FBI's past corruption. While there was no evidence to support this, the mere fact that it was a plausible theory to so many was a testament to the deep and lasting stain of the original sin that had characterized his relationship with the government. His body was claimed, and he was quietly buried, his funeral a small, private affair, a stark contrast to the very public and violent spectacle of his death. With his passing, the long, dark, and tangled saga of James Whitey Bulger was at last physically over. The demon was gone, but the questions, the scars, and the complex, painful legacy of his life remain, a permanent and troubling part of American criminal history, a story that forced a nation to confront the unsettling truth that sometimes the monsters are not just born in the shadows, but are actively and systematically created and nurtured by the very forces sworn to keep them at bay. The physical demise of James Whitey Bulger did not bring an end to his story. Instead, it opened a new and complex chapter of reckoning, one focused on dissecting the profound and lasting legacy of his unique brand of evil and the systemic failures that made it possible. In the wake of his death, the narrative shifted from the man himself to the broader, more disturbing questions his life posed about power, corruption, and the very nature of justice in America. The first and most glaring legacy was the deep, festering wound he left on the city of Boston, particularly the neighborhood of South Boston that had been both his kingdom and his hunting ground. For decades, a perverse code of silence, born from a mixture of fear, misplaced loyalty, and a deep-seated distrust of external authority, had allowed him to operate with impunity. He had skillfully cultivated an image as a protector of Southie, a man who kept hard drugs off the streets, a blatant hypocrisy given his own large-scale trafficking, and who provided loans and favors to those in need, all while his enforcers were breaking the knees of those who couldn't pay his exorbitant interest rates. This carefully constructed myth was permanently shattered by the tidal wave of testimony at his trial and the subsequent public airing of his crimes. The romanticized vision of the honorable gangster was exposed as a cruel fiction, revealing instead a man who exploited the very community he claimed to champion, leaving behind a trail of broken families and traumatized lives. The second, and perhaps more damaging, legacy was the indelible stain he left on the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The Bulger case became the textbook example of how a law enforcement agency, blinded by its own narrow objectives and corrupted by the ambition and venality of a few of its agents, could become a greater threat to justice than the criminals it was supposed to be pursuing. The relationship between Bulger and John Connolly was not an anomaly. It was the ultimate expression of a win at all costs mentality that had festered in the Boston office for years. The FBI's single-minded obsession with destroying the Italian mafia led them into a pact with a devil they believed they could control, only to discover that the devil was infinitely more cunning and ruthless. The subsequent lawsuits filed by the families of his victims, which resulted in multi-million-dollar settlements from the federal government, were a formal, legal admission of this catastrophic failure. These payouts were not just compensation, they were an official declaration that the government was, in a very real and tangible way, an accomplice to murder. This legacy forced a painful and ongoing process of introspection and reform within the FBI, leading to stricter guidelines for handling informants and greater oversight. But the shadow of the Bulger scandal continues to loom over the Bureau, a permanent cautionary tale about the dangers of sacrificing principle for perceived progress beyond the institutional damage. Bulger's life and death forced a cultural reckoning with our fascination with the outlaw figure. He was immortalized in books, in films like Black Mass, and in countless television documentaries. His story often told with a grim allure that risked glamorizing his violence. The challenge for history is to remember him, not as a charismatic anti-hero, but for what he truly was, a psychopathic businessman whose product was fear and whose tools were torture and murder. His story is not one of rise and fall in the classic tragic sense. It is a story of a sustained and systemic moral collapse, a demonstration of how corruption, once it takes root, can poison every institution it touches, from the street corners of a neighborhood to the highest levels of federal law enforcement. The final, chilling lesson of Whitey Bulger is that he was not a force of nature that descended upon Boston. He was a product of his environment, a creation of a specific time and place, and most damningly, a creation of the very system designed to stop him. His existence asks us an uncomfortable question. How many other monsters have we, as a society, inadvertently created or empowered through our own compromises, our own corruptions, and our own willingness to look the other way? The demon is gone, but the conditions that allowed the demon to flourish remain a subject of urgent and necessary scrutiny, ensuring that the story of Whitey Bulger will never be just a closed case file, but an open wound and a perpetual warning. To truly understand the monstrous entity that was James Whitey Bulger, one must venture beyond the timeline of events and into the dark, labyrinthine corridors of his own psyche, a landscape shaped by a toxic fusion of narcissism, paranoia, and a profound, almost pathological, absence of empathy. He was not a man given to explosive, hot-headed rage. His was a cold, calculating, and dispassionate cruelty, a quality that made him far more terrifying than any mere thug. His worldview was starkly Darwinian, a binary universe divided solely into predators and prey. And his life's work was ensuring he remained the ultimate predator in his chosen ecosystem. This mindset was forged in the crucible of his youth, tempered in the brutal federal penitentiaries of his early adulthood, and perfected during his reign in South Boston, where he learned that fear was a more potent and durable currency than affection or respect. His relationship with violence was not emotional, it was transactional. A murder was not a crime of passion. It was a business decision, a necessary piece of corporate housekeeping to eliminate a liability, silence a witness, or send a message to the market. This emotional detachment allowed him to order the death of a young woman like Deborah Hussey, or to participate in the torture of John McIntyre with the same dispassionate efficiency he might employ when balancing a ledger. He could, in one moment, calmly discuss the mechanics of a strangulation, and in the next, be seen casually buying ice cream for a neighborhood child, a Jekyll and Hyde act that required a compartmentalization beyond the grasp of most people. This was complemented by a narcissism of epic proportions. He saw himself as the smartest man in any room, the master strategist who was always 10 steps ahead of everyone else. His reading habit, while genuine, was also a part of this self-image. It fed his belief that he was an intellectual, a philosopher, king of the underworld, superior to the uneducated brutes who surrounded him. This arrogance was the key to his downfall, blinding him to the growing cracks in his empire and leading him to believe he could outsmart the entire federal justice system indefinitely. His refusal to admit he was an FBI informant, even when faced with overwhelming evidence, was the ultimate expression of this narcissism. To admit it would be to shatter the carefully constructed self-portrait of the honorable, stand-up gangster, a myth he clung to with a desperate, almost pathetic tenacity. It was a lie he told himself, and his insistence on maintaining it in the face of all reason ultimately crippled his own defense. Underpinning this entire psychological structure was a deep, pervasive paranoia, a constant, low-grade hum of suspicion that only grew louder as his power increased. He trusted no one completely, not even his closest partner, Stephen Flemmi, and certainly not his FBI handler, John Connolly. He saw every relationship as a potential vector of betrayal, every friendly gesture as a possible prelude to a setup. This paranoia was not entirely unfounded. He was, after all, betraying everyone around him, but it created a feedback loop of violence. The more he suspected others, the more people he had to kill to feel secure, and the more people he killed, the more he had to fear retaliation or exposure. His 16 years on the run were the ultimate manifestation of this paranoia, a life lived in a self-imposed prison of constant vigilance and isolation, where the face in the mirror was the only one he could almost trust. This psychological trifecta, the coldness of a sociopath, the arrogance of a narcissist, and the vigilance of a paranoid, created a perfect storm of criminality. It allowed him to build his empire, but it also contained the seeds of its own destruction. A more emotionally intelligent man might have known when to quit, when to take his fortune and disappear for good. A less arrogant man would have never believed he could so thoroughly corrupt the FBI without consequence. A less paranoid man might have enjoyed his ill-gotten gains rather than spending his life looking over his shoulder. Whitey Bulger was a prisoner of his own mind long before he became a prisoner of the state, a man doomed by the very traits that enabled his rise, a demon who was, in the final analysis, both the architect and the primary inhabitant of his own personal hell. The sprawling, decades-long saga of James Whitey Bulger is not merely the biography of a single man, but a complex tapestry woven with the threads of countless other lives, each one irrevocably altered by their proximity to his darkness. And among the most tragic and pivotal of these was his partner, Stephen, the Rifferman, Flemmy. To understand the full scope of Bulger's criminal enterprise is to understand the symbiotic and ultimately suicidal relationship he shared with Flemmy, a bond as deep and destructive as any in the annals of American crime. Flemmy was not a subordinate. He was a co-regent in Bulger's kingdom of fear, a seasoned and equally ruthless killer in his own right, whose partnership with Bulger provided a critical mass of violence and cunning that allowed them to dominate the Boston underworld. Where Bulger was the cold, calculating strategist, Flemmy was often the more hands-on enforcer, a man with a long and bloody resume, even before he formally joined forces with Bulger. Their alliance was a marriage of convenience and mutual respect among thieves, a recognition that together they were far more powerful than they could ever be apart. They complemented each other perfectly. Bulger's icy demeanor and political savvy paired with Flemmy's street level brutality and established connections. They became the twin engines of the Winter Hill Gang, the feared duo whose very names, spoken together, could silence a room. They dined together, planned heists and murders together, and shared in the immense profits of their criminal empire. They also, crucially, became top echelon informants for the FBI together, a decision that would bind them in a shared fate more tightly than any blood oath. For years, this partnership was the source of their incredible power, a fortress that seemed unassailable. They used the FBI to eliminate their rivals and used their criminal proceeds to enrich and corrupt their handlers, creating a perfect, self-sustaining cycle of corruption and violence. They were brothers in arms, bound by a code that they both professed to uphold, but were simultaneously violating by their very relationship with the FBI. This fraternity of the damned, however, contained the poison that would eventually destroy them both. The first crack appeared with the murders of the women in their inner circle. Flemmy's killing of his own girlfriend, Deborah Davis, with Bulger's assistance, and later, the joint murder of Flemmy's stepdaughter, Deborah Hussey, revealed a moral abyss so deep that not even a criminal code could justify it. These were not strategic killings of rival gangsters. They were the brutal exterminations of perceived liabilities. Acts that demonstrated a level of depravity that shocked even their hardened associates. When the federal government finally began to close in, the once unbreakable partnership shattered with the force of an earthquake, facing the rest of his life in prison, and possibly the death penalty. Flemmy made the calculated decision that Bulger himself would never make. He chose to save himself. He broke the code of silence that he and Bulger had lived by for decades and became the government's star witness. His testimony was the sledgehammer that the prosecution used to demolish Bulger's defense. On the witness stand, Flemmy was the antithesis of the charismatic gangster, He was a dry, matter-of-fact chronicler of horror, pointing a finger at his former partner and calmly detailing their shared atrocities. He provided the intimate, first-hand account that connected Bulger directly to murder after murder. His testimony all the more damning because of his former intimacy with the accused. In doing so, Flemmy achieved a form of survival, trading a death sentence for a life sentence without parole, but he also achieved a different kind of damnation. He became the ultimate rat, the man who had broken the very code he had once enforced with violence, ensuring his name would be reviled in the underworld long after his death. For Bulger, Flemmy's betrayal was the ultimate sin, a personal and professional transgression that eclipsed all others. It was Flemmy, more than any FBI agent or prosecutor, who truly brought Whitey Bulger down, who held a mirror up to his life and showed the world the monstrous reflection. The story of their partnership is a classic Greek tragedy played out on the streets of Boston, a tale of two men who rose to the greatest heights of power together, only to discover that the foundation of their alliance was built on the shifting sands of mutual self-interest, a foundation that could not withstand the pressures of true consequence, and when it crumbled, it buried them both in the same rubble. Beyond the brutal arithmetic of murders and millions of dollars, the story of James, Whitey Bulger is also a deeply human tragedy, one measured in the silent, enduring grief of the families he destroyed, the lives he cut short, and the psychological scars he inflicted upon an entire city. For every entry in his ledger of crime, there was a corresponding void in the world. A father who never came home, a daughter whose body was hidden for decades, a mother who went to her own grave without knowing the fate of her child. The true cost of Bulger's reign cannot be found in court transcripts or FBI files, but in the quiet, desperate anguish of people like Patricia Donahue, whose husband, Michael, an innocent electrician, was killed simply for offering a ride to a man Bulger wanted dead, leaving her a widow to raise their 3 young sons alone. It is found in the story of the Davis family, who for years searched for their sister Deborah, hoping against hope she was alive, only to have their worst fears confirmed in the most brutal way imaginable during Flemmy's testimony. It is in the haunting eyes of the Hussey family, who had to listen to the clinical description of how Deborah, a troubled young woman who saw Flemmy as a father figure, was strangled to death and her body disposed of like garbage. These families were sentenced to a life of a different kind of imprisonment, one of unanswered questions, of missed milestones, of birthdays and holidays forever shadowed by loss. For them, the capture, trial, and even the death of Bulger brought a complex and conflicted form of closure. There was a sense of justice being served, a relief that he could never harm anyone again. But it was a justice that could never truly compensate for their loss. The multi-million-dollar settlements won from the federal government, while an admission of culpability, were cold comfort for a stolen life. They were a tangible acknowledgement of a horrific failure, but they could not fill the empty chair at the dinner table. Furthermore, The public nature of the trial forced these families to relive their trauma in the most excruciating detail. As graphic photographs were displayed and the mechanics of their loved ones' murders were discussed with chilling detachment, the city of Boston itself, particularly the tight-knit community of South Boston, bore a different kind of scar. Bulger's legacy forced a painful introspection within the neighborhood. The code of silence that had once been a source of pride and a defense against a hostile outside world was now seen by many as a tool that had been exploited by a monster. The romanticized image of the local gangster, the stand-up guy who took care of his own, was permanently tarnished, replaced by the grim reality of a man who would kill a neighbor as easily as he would a rival. The community was left to grapple with its own complicity, however passive, in his reign of terror. The fear he instilled was so pervasive that it became a part of the social fabric, an unspoken rule that certain things were not discussed, certain questions were not asked. This collective trauma created a deep distrust of law enforcement that lasted for generations, a belief that the authorities were not to be trusted, a sentiment that Bulger and Connolly had actively cultivated and that outlived them both. The story of Whitey Bulger, therefore, is not a closed case. It is an open wound on the body of a city and its people. The physical evidence of his crimes may have been buried with his victims, and his own body may be in the ground, but the emotional and psychological aftermath continues to ripple through time. Every documentary made, every book written, every mention of his name brings a fresh wave of pain for those who suffered most directly at his hands. They are the true victims, the forgotten casualties in the epic of his life, the people for whom the name Whitey Bulger is not a headline or a legend, but a synonym for a personal, irreparable loss that defines their existence. Their stories are the essential, human counterpoint to the cold chronology of his crimes, a solemn reminder that behind every statistic of a gangland murder, there is a universe of shattered love and enduring sorrow. The name James Whitey Bulger has transcended the man himself to become a permanent fixture in the dark gallery of American infamy, a cultural symbol whose meaning shifts depending on the lens through which he is viewed. In the realm of popular culture, he has been immortalized and, to a troubling degree, mythologized. He is the archetypal gangster, a character so rich in contradiction and drama that he seems ripped from the pages of a crime novel rather than the police blotters of Boston. Johnny Depp's chilling portrayal in the film Black Mass captured the icy, reptilian stillness of the man, his pale, unblinking eyes serving as windows to a soul that seemed to have been vacated long ago. Other depictions in books, documentaries, and even television series have followed, each one adding another layer to the Bulger legend. This process of storytelling, while fascinating, carries with it an inherent danger, the glamorization of evil. There is a seductive quality to the narrative of the smart, disciplined gangster who outwits the system, a romantic anti-hero trope that can obscure the visceral, ugly reality of his actions. The carefully curated image Bulger himself cultivated, the bookish intellectual, the neighborhood benefactor, is easily co-opted by this narrative, creating a distorted picture that can overshadow the suffering of his victims. It is crucial to remember that the real Whitey Bulger was not a character. He was a psychopath who caused unimaginable human suffering, and the cultural fascination with him must always be tempered by that sobering truth. Beyond entertainment, his legacy serves as a dark, cautionary parable within the fields of criminology and law enforcement. The Bulger case is now a staple in FBI training academies and university criminal justice programs, studied not for its criminal techniques, but for its catastrophic failure of institutional integrity. It is the ultimate case study in how not to manage informants, a lesson in the perils of mission creep, where the goal of defeating one criminal organization of the mafia led to the empowerment and protection of another, arguably more savage one. It highlights the critical importance of oversight, the dangers of allowing individual agents too much autonomy, and the devastating consequences when the line between the police and the policed becomes irredeemably blurred. For law enforcement professionals, the name Bulger is not a legend. It is a synonym for their profession's greatest shame, a constant reminder of how easily authority can be corrupted and how noble goals can be perverted into their opposite. On a broader societal level, his story holds up a dark mirror to the American dream itself. He was a self-made man in the most twisted sense, a boy from the projects who used his intelligence, ambition, and ruthless will to power to build an empire. But his was a dream corrupted at its source, a perversion of the ideal that equates success with material wealth and power, regardless of the moral cost. His life is a stark rebuttal to the notion that crime pays in the end. It paid him with a life of paranoia, a violent death, and a legacy of shame. Yet, his enduring hold on the public imagination suggests a deep, collective fascination with the outliers, the individuals who live by their own rules entirely outside the social contract. We are repulsed by his actions, but we are also, perhaps uncomfortably, captivated by the sheer audacity of his life, by the scale of his defiance. He represents the ultimate. What if someone had the nerve to seize power by any means necessary, to live entirely without rules? The story of Whitey Bulger endures because it forces us to confront these dark questions about power, corruption, and the fragile nature of our own societal agreements. It is a story that is simultaneously repellent and compelling, a modern-day American epic whose final chapters were written not in ink, but in blood, and whose moral continues to be debated and dissected, ensuring that long after his death, the demon of Southie continues to haunt not just the city of Boston, but the very idea of justice in America. As the dust settles on the tumultuous and violent life of James Whitey Bulger, we are left not with a simple conclusion, but with a complex and unsettling mosaic of a man who was, in many ways, a walking paradox, a collection of contradictions that defy easy categorization. He was a creature of intense loyalty who betrayed everyone around him, a man who preached a strict criminal code while being the ultimate violation of that very code, a neighborhood icon who preyed upon the community he claimed to protect, and a ruthless pragmatist whose towering arrogance ultimately led to his downfall. To examine the totality of his 89 years is to stare into a profound moral abyss, a life that serves as a dark lesson in the corrupting nature of absolute power and the devastating consequences when the institutions designed to protect society become its greatest enablers. The question of what drove him, what core motivation fueled this decades-long campaign of terror, remains partially shrouded in mystery. Was it simply greed, a primal hunger for money, and the power it could buy? That was certainly a component, as evidenced by the vast sums of cash found in his Santa Monica apartment walls. Money that was useless to him in his prison of paranoia. Was it a lust for power, an addiction to the feeling of controlling life and death, of holding an entire city in a state of fear? This, too, seems undeniable. Given the cold pleasure he appeared to take in his own notoriety and the absolute authority he wielded over his subordinates. Or was it something deeper, more pathological? A fundamental void within his own psyche that could only be filled by dominating and destroying others. His apparent lack of remorse, his ability to compartmentalize acts of unspeakable cruelty, points toward a profound sociopathy, a man who was not so much evil by choice as he was broken by design, a machine built for predation. Perhaps the most terrifying answer is that it was all these things operating in concert. A perfect storm of avarice, ambition, and a missing moral compass. His relationship with the FBI was the ultimate expression of this complex pathology. He didn't just use the Bureau, he mastered it, turning its resources, its authority, and its weaknesses into weapons for his own criminal enterprise. He understood the vanity of agents like John Connolly, the institutional hunger for high-profile convictions, and the bureaucratic blind spots that could be exploited. In a perverse way, his corruption of the FBI was his greatest criminal achievement, a masterpiece of manipulation that demonstrated a chilling understanding of human nature and systemic vulnerability. Yet, this same alliance contained the seeds of his own destruction, creating a web of dependencies and secrets that was ultimately too vast and too volatile to be sustained. The final, brutal irony of his life is that the very thing that granted him unprecedented power, his status as an informant, became the justification for his murder in prison, the ultimate sin in the world he professed to rule. His death in a Florida penitentiary, beaten to death with a lock in a sock, was a grimly appropriate end, a dose of the very street, level justice he had so often administered, a reminder that the monster was, in the end, vulnerable to the same brutal physics of violence that he had imposed on so many others. It was an end without redemption, without catharsis, without meaning. It was simply an end, as stark and unforgiving as the man himself. The story of Whitey Bulger does not offer easy answers or moral clarity. It is a messy, ugly, and profoundly disturbing narrative that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the world. It shows us that evil is not always a cartoonish villain. Sometimes it is a calm, calculating man in a car, watching and waiting. It shows us that justice is not always swift or sure. Sometimes it is delayed for decades, and even when it arrives, it can feel incomplete and unsatisfying. And most importantly, it shows us that the line between order and chaos, between the law and the lawless, is often far thinner and more permeable than we would like to believe. The demon is gone, but the echoes of his footsteps through the halls of power and the alleyways of Boston will reverberate for generations, a somber and eternal reminder of the darkness that can flourish when light is willingly extinguished. And so, we reach the end of our long and harrowing journey through the life and times of James Whitey Bulger, a narrative that has stretched from the crowded, striving streets of South Boston to the sun-bleached, anonymous confinement of a California apartment, and finally to the brutal, concrete finality of a prison cell. We have traced the arc of a boy who became a king, a man who became a monster, and a legend that became a warning. We have delved into the murders, the corruption, the betrayals, and the profound, lasting pain left in his wake. This story, drawn from the cold, hard facts of court records and the heartfelt anguish of victim impact statements, was brought to you with the sole purpose of presenting the truth, of ensuring that the correct information reaches you, not as sensationalized fiction, but as a sobering historical account. The tale of Whitey Bulger is now complete, but its echoes remain. It is etched into the soul of Boston, a permanent scar on the city's history. It is studied in FBI academies as a lesson in catastrophic failure. It lives on in the families who must bear the weight of his cruelty for generations. And it persists in our collective consciousness as a dark fable about the seductive nature of power and the terrifying ease with which justice can be subverted from within. The demon has been named, his crimes cataloged, his empire dismantled, and his body buried. But the questions his life raised about authority, corruption, and the very nature of evil are questions we must continue to ask ourselves, lest we forget the lessons paid for in so much blood. If this deep dive into one of the most complex and chilling criminal minds in American history has held your attention, if it has provided you with a comprehensive understanding you were seeking, then our mission here is accomplished. This story was presented in a calm, narrative style to ensure the facts remain the focus, free from unnecessary drama, allowing the weight of the history itself to hold the power. If you found this exploration engaging and informative, then I invite you to take action. Please show your support for this channel by liking this video, subscribing for more deep dives into true crime, history, and the stories that shape our world. Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. We value this community and the discussions we have. And most importantly, share this video with others who might be interested in a thorough, factual, and engaging account of this dark chapter. Your engagement is what allows us to continue bringing you well-researched, comprehensive content. Thank you for listening, for investing your time in this extensive narrative, and for joining us on this detailed journey into the heart of a darkness that, though now past, will never be forgotten.